There was a brief stretch at the start of the 2000s when horror felt different. Not loud, not fast, just uneasy. This was the era when fear turned inward, when technology, isolation, memory, and identity became just as threatening as anything supernatural. The internet was new, surveillance was creeping into everyday life, and horror films started asking quieter questions about control, paranoia, and what happens when systems fail. These movies didn't rely on jump scares or body counts. They lingered, they unsettled, and somehow, without trying, they captured the anxiety of a world on the edge of something it didn't fully understand yet. Looking back now, it's hard to believe these films are already more than 20 years old, because the fears they tapped into never really went away. Session 9, 2001. An asbestos removal crew accepts a job clearing out the abandoned Danvers State Mental Hospital, a massive, decaying structure left behind by modern psychiatry. As they work their way through the building, exhaustion and financial pressure begin to strain the group. One crew member discovers old therapy recordings from a former patient, and as the tapes play on, the hospital's past starts bleeding into the present. The story unfolds through slow erosion rather than sudden shocks. Gordon, the crew leader, tries to hold everything together as stress fractures his judgment. Around him, small resentments grow into open hostility. The therapy tapes, recordings of a woman diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, quietly mirror what's happening to the crew, offering clues without ever spelling things out. Danvers itself does most of the work. Filmed inside the real hospital before its demolition, the location feels oppressive and endless. Long corridors, peeling walls, light leaking in through broken windows. Director Brad Anderson relies on natural sound and minimal music, allowing footsteps, echoes, and silence to create unease. Violence is mostly implied, letting imagination fill in the gaps. Session 9 is psychological horror built on atmosphere and implication. It moves deliberately, trusting patience over payoff. The ending refuses clear answers, inviting interpretation rather than closure. For some, that restraint is frustrating. For others, it's what makes the film linger. A cult favorite that proves a setting can carry terror all on its own. Frailty, 2001. A man walks into an FBI office and calmly claims he's responsible for a series of murders attributed to a killer known as God's Hand. What follows is a confession told through memory. His childhood in rural Texas, where his widowed father believed he was chosen by God to destroy demons hiding in human form. As the father brings victims home, forcing his sons to help, the family fractures. One boy accepts the divine mission. The other sees only violence and delusion. The story is driven by conviction rather than spectacle. Bill Paxton directs with restraint and plays the father as sincere, disciplined, and terrifyingly calm. He doesn't rant or rage, he believes. The children at the center of the story ground the horror emotionally, selling the confusion, fear, and loyalty that make escape impossible. In the present day, the FBI investigation unfolds quietly, listening rather than interrogating, as the past slowly reshapes the meaning of every word spoken. Violence is blunt but controlled. Murders happen quickly, often off-screen, leaving aftermath and implication to do the work. The question isn't how brutal the acts are, but whether they're justified. Paxton keeps the film balanced on that uncertainty, using plain locations and natural light to strip away any sense of fantasy. Everything feels disturbingly plausible. Frailty is horror built on belief systems colliding with family loyalty. Its final act doesn't offer comfort. It forces reconsideration. Paxton's only film as director is confident, patient, and unsettling, proving you don't need spectacle to explore terrifying ideas. A quiet, intelligent thriller that lingers because it asks questions most horror films avoid. May, 2002. May has spent her life on the outside of human connection. Raised with strict rules about how she's allowed to be touched, she grows into a lonely veterinary assistant whose closest companion is a childhood doll sealed behind glass. When she finally reaches out to a charming but emotionally distant man and to a coworker who offers fleeting warmth, her need for closeness quickly overwhelms them both. The story unfolds from May's perspective, making her isolation impossible to ignore. Angela Bettis gives a remarkably vulnerable performance, capturing social awkwardness, longing, and confusion without ever turning the character into a joke. Jeremy Sisto and Anna Faris play people who are intrigued by May but unwilling to meet her where she is, reinforcing the pattern of rejection that defines her life. Violence enters slowly. What begins as emotional discomfort escalates into physical harm, each step justified through May's warped but sincere logic. The practical effects remain grounded and tactile, building toward a final sequence that's grotesque and deeply sad, rather than sensational. Director Lucky McKee keeps the camera intimate, using framing and color to emphasize May's separation from the world around her. May is character-driven horror at its most uncomfortable. It's a film about loneliness, unmet needs, and what happens when empathy arrives too late. Disturbing without cruelty, it remains memorable not for its shock value, but for how completely it understands its protagonist, even as it condemns her actions. The Mothman Prophecies, 2002. A journalist's life fractures after his wife dies in a car accident, moments after claiming she saw something impossible. 2 years later, on a routine work trip, he becomes inexplicably lost and ends up in a small town in West Virginia, hundreds of miles off course. The locals are already shaken. People report sightings of a winged figure, strange dreams that predict disasters, and phone calls that seem to come from nowhere. As the journalist digs deeper, he realizes these events mirror the warnings that came before his wife's death. Rather than following a conventional investigation, the film settles into obsession. Richard Gere plays the journalist as a man hollowed out by grief, pulled forward by answers he may not survive hearing. Laura Linney grounds the story as a local officer caught between skepticism and growing fear. Will Patton leaves a lasting impression as a man receiving eerie calls from an entity calling itself Indrid Cold. Calm, curious, and deeply unsettling. The horror stays deliberately out of reach. The creature is never clearly shown, existing mostly through suggestion, sound, and reaction. Disorienting edits, warped audio, and sudden visual distortions create a sense that reality itself is unreliable. Instead of jump scares, the film leans on inevitability, knowledge arriving too late to stop what's coming. The Mothman Prophecies isn't about monsters in the traditional sense. It's about grief, fate, and the terror of receiving warnings without understanding them. More cosmic mystery than creature feature, it finds its power in restraint and unanswered questions. Quiet, unsettling, and emotionally heavy, it lingers long after the final scene fades out. Below, 2002. During World War II, a U.S. submarine rescues survivors from a torpedoed hospital ship, including a British nurse. The mission immediately goes wrong. As the submarine continues through enemy-controlled waters, crew members begin dying in what appear to be freak accidents. Falls, machinery failures, sudden violence. With no way to surface safely and no clear explanation, suspicion turns inward. Something is wrong with the ship itself. The story gradually reframes its threat. Bruce Greenwood plays the new captain as calm and capable, but burdened by unspoken guilt tied to the submarine's past. Olivia Williams brings intelligence and skepticism to the nurse, serving as an outsider who questions both the crew's behavior and the vessel's history. The ensemble feels authentically military, tight-knit, disciplined, and slowly unraveling under pressure. The horror is almost entirely atmospheric. The submarine's interior does the heavy lifting. Cramped corridors, constant mechanical noise, water dripping where it shouldn't. The supernatural elements are restrained. Shadows, unexplained sounds, deaths that could still be explained away as human error. Below works because it never rushes its hand. It's as much about buried guilt and command decisions as it is about haunting. The eventual revelations land precisely because the film earns them through patience and mood rather than spectacle. Quiet, tense, and overlooked, It's a smart blend of war thriller and ghost story that deserves far more recognition than it received. Identity, 2003. A violent storm strands 10 strangers at a remote Nevada motel. With roads washed out and help unreachable, they wait for daylight, until guests begin dying one by one. Each death aligns with a numbered motel room key, suggesting a deliberate pattern. As paranoia escalates, the survivors realize their lives may be connected in ways far more disturbing than coincidence. Elsewhere, a convicted killer's execution is halted for a last-minute psychiatric hearing, hinting that the two stories may be linked. The film unfolds like a classic closed-circle mystery before quietly reshaping itself. John Cusack anchors the chaos as a weary limo driver forced into leadership, while Ray Liotta, Amanda Peet, and John Hawkes bring volatility and unease to the ensemble. No one feels safe, and everyone feels suspect. In the parallel storyline, Alfred Molina adds weight as the psychiatrist probing the killer's fractured mind. Violence arrives suddenly, stabbings, drownings, and accidents staged with grounded intensity rather than spectacle. The motel becomes a pressure cooker as exits vanish and trust erodes. Rain, darkness, and isolation do much of the work, while the film steadily funnels toward a high-concept reveal. Directed by James Mangold, Identity commits fully to its twist, a choice that sharply divides audiences. For some, it deepens the film's themes of fractured identity and control. For others, it feels like an intellectual sleight of hand. Either way, the execution is confident, the pacing tight, and the performances strong enough to carry the gamble. A slick psychological thriller that embraces risk and invites debate long after the final reveal. The Cell, 2000. Using experimental technology, a child psychologist enters the minds of coma patients to help repair psychological damage. When a serial killer collapses before revealing where his latest victim is hidden, she's sent into his subconscious to find the answer. Time is limited. The woman is trapped in a sealed glass chamber slowly filling with water. Inside the killer's mind, reality dissolves into ritual, symbolism, and violence. The external story is straightforward. Inside the mindscape, nothing is. The killer sees himself as a god-king ruling over suffering, while fragments of childhood trauma interrupt his fantasy of control. Jennifer Lopez plays the psychologist with restraint, grounding the film's most abstract sequences. Vincent D'Onofrio delivers a dual performance, physically monstrous within the dream world and disturbingly fragile beneath it. Vince Vaughn operates in the real world, pushing the investigation forward as the clock runs down. What defines the film is its visual language. Director Tarsum Singh stages each mental space like a living art installation. Ceremonial costumes, impossible architecture, bodies arranged as sculpture. Practical and digital effects blend seamlessly. A horse divided into perfect sections, figures suspended by metal rings, flesh treated as environment. Every image is deliberate, composed, and unsettling. The Cell is unapologetically style-driven. The crime story is familiar, even thin, but the imagery pushes far beyond conventional thrillers. It's a film that values sensation over explanation, mood over logic. Divisive by design, it works best when viewed less as narrative and more as experience, an exploration of how horror can live entirely inside the mind. Pulse, 2001. In modern Tokyo, something is leaking through the internet. Computer screens become portals, empty rooms grow hostile, and people who encounter these presences withdraw from the world entirely. There's no invasion in the traditional sense, just quiet collapse. As connections multiply, so does isolation, and the boundary between the living and the dead begins to dissolve. The story follows several young people trying to understand what's happening as society slowly unravels around them. They search for meaning, companionship, and explanation, but every attempt at connection arrives too late. Characters don't panic or fight. They drift, mirroring a world losing its ability to sustain human presence. The performances are restrained, intentionally hollowed out as emotional exhaustion spreads. Director Kiyoshi Kurosawa builds horror through absence rather than action. Ghosts appear in unnatural, stuttering movements, as if reality itself is misfiring. They occupy doorways, hallways, and computer rooms, spaces meant for passage or communication. Practical effects are minimal but unforgettable. Shadows detach, figures leave stains instead of bodies, and people vanish without spectacle. Pulse is apocalyptic horror without explosions. It suggests the world ends not through violence, but through loneliness becoming irreversible. Slow, devastating, and deeply unsettling, it treats technology not as a tool of connection, but as a magnifier of emptiness. More than 2 decades later, its vision feels disturbingly close, an essential work of modern Japanese horror that lingers long after the screen goes dark. 1.0, 2004. A reclusive computer programmer lives alone in a hyper-automated apartment building where every action is monitored and optimized. One day, a small package arrives at his door. Empty. Then another, and another. With no sender and no explanation, the deliveries trigger a slow psychological breakdown. Surveillance cameras feel more present. Neighbors act rehearsed, and his apartment no longer feels like a place he controls. The film unfolds almost entirely through his perspective. Jeremy Sisto carries the story as a man whose logical mind can't process a system that refuses to explain itself. Deborah Kara Unger briefly represents genuine human connection, only to be quietly erased once she becomes inconvenient. Everyone else feels like part of the machinery. Residents, technicians, corporate figures who speak in calm reassurances while offering no real answers. The horror is minimal and conceptual. There are no monsters, no explosive set pieces. Instead, dread builds through repetition and denial. The building's clean design becomes oppressive. White walls, locked doors, cameras that never blink. The technology is never fully visualized. Nanotechnology is implied through symptoms and behavior rather than spectacle, making the threat feel invasive and unavoidable. The final realization lands with cold inevitability. There is no escape route because the experiment doesn't need consent anymore. The system is already inside him. 1.0 is low-budget science fiction that understands restraint. It trades action for paranoia and leaves viewers with an unsettling idea. The most effective control systems don't attack. They normalize. Quiet, bleak, and increasingly relevant, it's a forgotten tech horror film that feels more accurate with every passing year. FearDotCom, 2002. A string of unexplained deaths leads a detective to a disturbing pattern. Every victim visited the same website exactly 48 hours before they died. The site streams graphic recordings tied to a serial killer who terrorized the city years earlier. But the killer is dead. What's still active is something worse. Rather than focusing on traditional investigation, the film leans into mood and sensation. Stephen Dorff and Natasha McElhone play officials circling a mystery that refuses to behave logically, while Stephen Rea looms in flashbacks as the original killer. Character development is secondary. The story is more interested in creating a sense of contamination. Once you've seen the site, you're already marked. Visually, FearDotCom goes all in. The image is drenched in sickly greens and icy blues, pushing early 2000s music video aesthetics to an extreme. Deaths are surreal and exaggerated. Bleeding eyes, impossible injuries, ghostly apparitions invading physical space. The website itself isn't meant to feel real. It's an abstract nightmare, closer to a haunted video installation than an actual corner of the internet. The result is a film that feels more like an anxiety dream than a thriller. FearDotCom captures a very specific moment when the internet felt unknowable and dangerous, but it mistakes style for substance. The premise is strong, the execution overwhelming. More interesting as a cultural artifact than a successful horror film, it stands as a cautionary example of how fast tech-based fear can date itself. If you love discovering forgotten horror and cult cinema, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the films time forgot. Thanks for watching, and remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is someone's favorite.